Well, let me thank John for that very kind introduction. I should say he mentioned mathematics and geography, which have basically been the basis of my academic career, but I have always considered myself to be an operational researcher, and I think I was actually a fellow of the Operational Research Society in 1971, and so you can begin to do some calculations. But it's a great pleasure to be here. Great honour to be invited and actually to give a talk in memory of Lord Blackett. And I thought I would find a text for the talk, if that's not an inappropriate phrase. And I found this one, published in Operations Research in 1950. The most important qualification for an operational research worker is an ability to take a broad view of a problem so that important factors are not to be missed. And I'm going to talk about operational research in the age of AI, and I'm going to argue that there are tremendous opportunities in the future for operational research, but it involves taking on what might be unusually big problems. So I'm talking about thinking big, and I will give a few examples of that. So I'm going to talk about the nature of the new age. I'm going to talk about the impact of AI. Needless to say, I've been on a very steep learning curve myself in the last 2.5 years to understand the basics of data science and AI. But I think I can now at least talk about the bones of it, and then to ask what that means for operational research and to look ahead a bit. So, the starting point, what's new? So the age of AI implies something that's new. And I've actually listed 4 things there. The first is computing power. The second is the volume of data, the so-called big data revolution. A recognition of the value of data and AI itself and its package of algorithms. You are all familiar with the OI toolkit, and I'm going to talk a bit about how I think AI expands the OR toolkit. So going through the basic disciplines, which is what I've done there, math, statistics, computer science, and domain knowledge, which is critical beyond the tools in all applications. When we put all that together, we become modelers. We deal with optimization, decision support, planning, delivery, and so on. And I put a note on the end of that slide. But basically, something that's been in my intellectual toolkit for decades that I learned from an American city planner called Britton Harris many, many years ago. And he used to say, if you have a planning problem, remember we're talking about cities, but it generalizes. It involves 3 kinds of thinking, and he called this policy, design, and analysis. And 1 or 2 of you here I know tonight who've heard me lecture to you as students at UCL will remember the weight that I put on this. And what he used to say is, policy, decide what we're about, objectives, problems to be solved. Analysis is actually what most of us do as researchers. We're analysts. I build computer models of cities. I build how cities work. I'm an analyst. Design, other words like invention. If you have a big challenge or you have a plan, analytics doesn't solve it. What solves it, if you can solve it, is actually combining the insights of analytics on those challenges with imaginative thinking about design. And what Britt used to say to me, in the big planning problems, you very rarely found all 3 kinds of thinking in the same room. And so one of the things at the back of what I want to talk about tonight is finding all 3 kinds of thinking in the same room. We're still talking about what's changed. I mean, if we go through the main sectors, all have had industrial revolutions. In fact, the agricultural sector is probably now having a new one. I was reading a paper about robotic tractors the other day. Industry has been automated through robotics. The retail sector is a very interesting one because for me it actually represents something where you can actually see the phase changes taking place, usually after the event. The trick is to be able to predict them. But corner shops to supermarkets was one of those transitions. And it's a phase change almost in the physics sense, not in terms of seconds, but in centuries of one way of selling food was changed to another way in about a 5-year period, the corner shops to supermarkets transition. And then the Amazon online retailing transition is another one. I'm actually going to argue that public sector services are ripe for a major change. And on the whole, it's not yet happening. And of course, we have, IT has its own sector. And what I'm going to talk about with AI feeds back into all of these sectors. So, in talking about OR in the age of AI, I thought I ought to start by saying what AI is, or my reading of what AI is, and then what it's good at, and then what it's not so good at. So start with the basics of what is AI good at. It can, and I'm talking about what machines can do in effect. They can read text, they can hear. We get this now online where you ring and you get an automated chat box which will tell you what you ought to do. They can see. If you think of the whole autonomous vehicles drive, they have to be able to see. So computer vision in autonomous vehicles, will get you so far. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And they can write. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Zubin Garamani, Cambridge, now chief scientist of Uber, and he produced what he calls the automatic statistician. And you feed data into the automatic statistician, and it basically from the data, it goes through every conceivable form of statistical analysis. But when I've heard Zubin talk about this, I see it's actually written a report. And I assumed that all the data came out and the results came out and Zubin wrote a report. But no, the machine writes the report. So I did ask him whether he'd submitted one of these to a journal, because I think that would be really interesting. But I've never had a positive answer to that. So these machines can write and they can translate. I mean, we all probably use Google Translate regularly. Put all these together, and you can actually then do much more complicated things. So AI drives robotics. In effect, soft robotics, I now learn, is used to describe automating processes, very much OR. It can help understand markets, customers, clients. So I call that about influencing. And again, there's some big challenges there. But essentially what AI-driven machines will do is respond to rules. And it's putting these things together which actually facilitates the re-engineering of many processes. And I think if you add the new tools to the classic OR tools, you begin to see the possibilities of OR in the age of AI. Rounding this off, from big data, people understanding the value of it, to what I'm calling learning machines. So we have new data everywhere. We have sensors everywhere. We have real-time data. And I think that leads us into a world of real-time OR. We have better data for modeling complex systems. I work my research hat, wearing my research hat, I work on computer models of cities. It used to take months to calibrate a model. I think we're now within sight of being able to calibrate models in real time. And again, I'll come back to that as one of my examples in a minute. If you look at the impact of machine learning, some people say that machine learning is statistics reinvented. There's a huge amount of statistics inside machine learning. Machine learning algorithms are brilliant at clustering. It's critical, as again I'll argue in a minute, in the context of health. And I was actually, it's very interesting to see how old worlds meet new worlds. I was walking down a corridor in the Alan Turing Institute actually a few months ago, and we have glass-walled meeting rooms, and I could see a guy giving a talk to a lot of our students, I guess, and I could hear what he was saying and see his screen. And he said, and this is called principal components analysis. Now, some of you will remember doing principal components analysis in the 1960s or 1970s, particularly when social science first became quantitative. And new things have been reinvented, and they're being reinserted in machine learning algorithms. And the scale of the computing power and the scale of the data makes it very different to what it was. Deep learning we hear a lot about, which is essentially neural networks on a bigger scale. But what I'm actually saying here is, it might just sound at first as I'm arguing that it's more of the same, but it isn't more of the same. It's drawing on some of it, a lot of it, but it is a revolution because the computing power and the big data actually makes it very different. In terms of the Turing test, again, one of the themes I'm going to develop a bit is that we haven't got to a point, and I suspect we're actually nowhere near a point, where passing the Turing test would mean building a machine that can think. And what I want to argue is machines don't think, but they can learn, and systems can learn. I'm using machines in a very general sense. A big governmental system, the health system, as I will talk about it, is a machine. And it's a learning machine. It's a machine that can learn. So let me then say very briefly something about what AI is good at. That's what AI is good at, sorry. What it's potentially less good at. Use of data, do we have consent? In fact, one of the papers in one of the awards was about breaches in terms of data privacy. The deep learning algorithms are typically not transparent. I'm told that if you actually use transparent machine learning algorithms for certain kind of business decision processes, they're not as good as the non-transparent ones. And you then have to think through how to handle that. I mean, there's a research program to make algorithms more transparent. There's an argument about whether that can be done or not, complicated mathematics. Or you've got to surround them by something like an appeal system that will take you in the direction of fairness and avoiding bias, the next two bullet points on that slide. So there's a whole stack of ethical issues. And as John said in his introduction, I've now taken on the job of setting up within the Nuffield Foundation the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is very much concerned with these challenges. I actually think there's some serious hype. I mean, the car manufacturers clearly think that autonomous vehicles will be on the streets within a relatively small number of years. And some of them are on the streets. I mean, you know, there are tests in Milton Keynes, and there are bigger tests in the US. But what I suspect hasn't happened, or I haven't seen it happen, is for somebody to model a whole urban system, a whole city, that's actually being run with autonomous vehicles. And I think all the focus of the research has been on a small number of vehicles in a small environment. And of course, there are huge challenges. If there is graffiti on a road sign, the car stops. It doesn't know what the road sign is. And those kind of challenges have to be overcome at a micro level before we get anywhere near to that functioning at a system level. But I then have one point on the end of this slide which I want to run right through everything I'm saying, and it's what I call the Mike Lynch challenge. You'll be aware of Mike Lynch as the guru of machine learning. And I heard Mike give a lecture. He gave a lecture actually for the Turing Institute. Actually, it was about 15 months ago. And he gave a really nice history of AI. You know, it's had summers, it's had winters. We're now in the summer. Is there going to be another winter? In this case, probably not, actually, would be my guess. But at the end of this lecture, he said, the biggest research challenge for machine learning is the incorporation of prior knowledge. And that really was a very important statement for me coming from a machine learner, because I'm basically a mathematical modeler, I'm an operations research modeler. How does that connect to AI? And there's still a big challenge there to solve that. What you can't do is start from scratch. There is an argument that you can throw the data into machine learning algorithms and it will somehow do your analytics for you. And if you've had 50 years of modeling big complex systems, that doesn't happen. I sometimes use a very extreme example. It will be like going to CERN, taking all the data from the synchrotron, feeding it into machine learning algorithms, and expecting to learn the laws of quantum mechanics. And life isn't like that, but we have to be explicit about those kinds of challenges. Okay, so I'll now go on to the substance of what I want to talk about in terms of my title, about OR in the age of AI. So what I've been arguing is that OR-based re-engineering, which is what much of OR is about, will continue with core AI skills added to it. And then I've just quoted Mike Lynch, but I also quite like to quote Michael Jordan. And this says something about the hype in AI. He wrote a really nice piece where he said too much of AI research has been based on imitating humans and actually trying to make machines think. And he turned AI round into IA and say what we're really doing is augmenting intelligence augmentation. And if you think about that and actually think about putting the right infrastructure in place, and I think that's a big challenge. My throwaway line at the end of this is actually to say I think one of the really big challenges with big data is designing the information systems that actually have it all together in a usable in a usable way, and I think we underestimate that. So another thing to keep in mind. I said at the start I wanted to talk about ambition. I want to talk about, I'll call it thinking big, crude phrase, but I apologize, but it epitomizes what I want to say. So obviously current OR practice will continue with updated technology. But what I want to argue now is that beyond that, and that's all, has all the value that OR has always had. So I'm not in any way saying that that will diminish or lessen or stop. It will be enhanced. But what I want to argue is there are opportunities that involve large, complex systems and those challenges for OR to think big. And so I'm going to talk through two examples. One is health. And this is work that I really learned about while I've been in the Turing Institute. And one is cities, which, so I'm allowing myself the liberty to talk about my own field, where I've had to sit in the Turing Institute and say, as an urban modeler, somebody who builds computer models of cities, what can I add from what I'm now learning about AI? And what I hope you might all be able to do is to generalize what I'm saying from these two examples into many other fields. And I'll give you very briefly some examples of the other fields. But let me start by talking about healthcare. And the work that I'm going to describe here is the work of my Turing colleague, professor in Cambridge, Mihaela van der Schaar. And this is a picture of Mihaela giving her Turing lecture about a year ago. I'm also going to say something in a minute about some work we've done with the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, which is listed there, which actually illustrates this. But I'm first of all going to talk about this work and what it can be done in very general terms. And then I've got one diagram that summarizes what I'm about to say. And then I've got some of Mihaela's slides, which I'll skip through just so you can see what it's like in real life. But let me say this, what I want you to think about, so I'm losing my voice, so what I want you to think about is the health system as having three phases. Phase one, patients arrive and they arrive with a lot of data. And some of that may be historical records in doctors' handwriting, it could be MRI scans, blood tests, the whole lot. And somehow that has to be wrangled together, data wrangling, in a form that it will go into a machine learning algorithm. And what Mihaela does in phase two is to take that data, she adds social data to that of the patient, and feeds it into a machine learning algorithm that will do the clustering. I talked earlier about clustering. So phase 2, you do the clustering. And so you get patients by type, by social type, and by disease, state of disease, and so on. And that is the augmented intelligence for the clinician. The clinician then produces a treatment plan for that patient. And phase 3, which is what I think we're not very good at, is actually evaluating the treatment plans. But assume in an ideal world that we have a system that will evaluate the treatment plans. So what's going to become my learning machine has phase 1 with lots of patients flowing through. Phase 2, machine learning-based medical diagnostics for that patient, augmenting intelligence for the clinician. Phase 3, evaluating treatment plans. And then a feedback loop. And the feedback loop is what brings about the learning. So over a period of time, you will have thousands, perhaps even millions, we're talking big systems here, perhaps millions of patients coming into the system, going into phase 2, and when a new patient enters, because the machine has learned, that patient will go into a very precisely defined cluster against which you will have the optimum treatment plan, because you have the feedback of experience from many different kinds of treatment plans. So it's, in some ways it's idealistic, but I call this slide revolutionizing healthcare, because I gave this bit of the talk to a group in the Department of Health, where they have a subgroup on bioinformatics, using Mahela's slides and acknowledging it's all her work. And somebody in that audience said to me, there's one word on each of those slides, Alan, and if that is real, it will revolutionize the NHS. And so I actually wanted to call this revolutionizing the NHS, but the last time I talked about it, I was told that was too political, and I should talk about revolutionizing healthcare. But of course I was saying, what's the word, what's the word? And the word was automated. And in principle, each of those phases could be automated. Now, I'm not so naive as to say the clinicians would disappear, nor do I want the clinicians to disappear, nor will radiologists disappear in phase 1. But everything will be seriously enhanced. And you do have a possibility. 10 years down the line, Mahela would say it was 20 years down the line, of the health system being cheaper and better. But what I'm arguing is that is a big OR challenge. So to formalize what I've just said, and I want to use this slide, I think 3 times, certainly 2 or 3 times. Top left is the data arriving, so it's the data wrangling challenge as patients come in, if I'm talking about health. Top right are your analytics toolkit. I've got that there as a data science analytics. Domain knowledge is obviously critical at this point. This isn't something that happens by magic without domain knowledge. Hence the clinicians producing treatment plans. And then it goes into a feedback loop. So think of that as just so the bottom is the evaluation of treatment plans. So think of that as a formal way of presenting what I've just been saying about the 3 phases in health. But there's a penny to drop, which I'm sure has dropped by now, which is that actually this is a generic system. So I want to say a little bit more about health, and then I just want to say what the possible range of applications are for this system. So I'm now on to Mahela's slides. So this is Mahela actually putting some flesh on my very broad account of the 3 phases. So patients arrive in. I won't go through this in detail. You've got all the data collection, which is turned up now on the right-hand side. It connects to wearables that actually feed data continually into a system. It's like your Fitbit, which feeds things into things that monitor where your heart works and so on. Potentially much more of that. And then she will turn this into pathways, prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment. I mean, she has 4 stages there because she's actually gone back a stage. If the learning machine is working, you can actually do a lot more about prevention, a lot there on where it happens. And then I wanted to say a little bit more about this slide without talking about it in detail, because what her analysis will do is to say something about projecting the forward trajectories of a disease. And if you turn up to, if you present yourself as a patient, your future and your clinician's treatment plan will depend on your previous illnesses. In other words, your propensity to have a heart attack, which is what you've turned up with, will depend on your past history on various other things. And in the jargon, as I understand it, and I apologise because I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who know more about this than I do in health in the room, is the problem of modelling comorbidities. And so what Mihaela is now doing is taking the statistical and mathematical challenge of modelling comorbidities actually to be able to look forward. And I'll give you a very explicit example of that in a minute, and then into treatment pathways and so on. Now, the example I want to talk about, as I mentioned when I introduced Mihaela's work, is some work that we've been doing for the Cystic Fibrosis Trust. And this has been a very interesting example of working with AI, actually with all the CFT clinicians who, I don't quite know the basis of it. I suspect the NHS must have contracted the trust to look after cystic fibrosis patients. Fortunately, at any one time in the UK, there are only about 10,000 people with cystic fibrosis, and the trust has fantastic historical data, and they have consent to use it because it's a very small population. And so what Mihaela's been doing is using the historical data to feed into machine learning algorithms to actually then make predictions from those patients. And because it's historical data with quite a long run, she's been able to compare her predictions with the judgments of the clinicians at the time. And we're already in a state where we're doing much better, I'll say we, meaning Mihaela's team really, better than the clinicians. And so the CFT clinicians are now very, very excited about having this augmented intelligence. So by working in this way, we actually have a pilot model of the whole system that I've been talking about, which is a kind of demonstration of what can be made to work. Now, to translate that into the much bigger health system area is a huge challenge. But it's been good to get this far. In fact, it's just worth noting on that slide that from CFT data, we've been working with something like 115 different variables on particular patients. And so, you know, trying to predict survival in particular, I'll come back to that, complications, which is actually the comorbidities issue, lung functions, infections. In fact, one of the challenges is to try to use machine learning on a patient presenting, or indeed just from continuous provision of data that will actually predict the onset of an infection a couple of days before a GP would. In terms of observable symptoms. And if that can be done, you actually add years to the life expectancy of a cystic fibrosis patient. So that itself is a very important challenge. Does automate this. She's very good at looking at all the alternative algorithms for doing the predictions, and she'll predict the optimum algorithms. But what I wanted to say with the final slide of these is where her work, I think, has produced a case study of actually enhancing the intelligence for clinicians, in other words, doing better than they were doing, is actually predicting mortality. And one of the things they have to do is to put the patients at the top of the lung transplant list who are most at risk. And that is obviously very, very serious stuff. And that is now being fed in to the way that cystic fibrosis patients, as I understand it, are being treated and monitored. So that's what I want to say about that example, but I then want to just make, to summarize really, the implications of what I've been saying about health in this kind of context. Other researchers all over the world are doing the kind of work that Mihail is doing. I'm not saying it's unique to us and the Turing Institute. And there are some spectacular results around, but it's all very fragmented. I don't really see signs of people doing what I'd call whole system work, where the three phases that I described are actually integrated into what I'm calling a learning system. In this country, we're not yet in a state, we haven't yet got NHS data in a state where we can begin to do that. And that of itself is a serious challenge. So that's the first point that I want to make, that we have to, there are challenges through all three phases. But it is a kind of workflow challenge. If you've got all the bits in place, an OR can contribute to some of that. It's actually a classic OR problem then, of putting the whole thing together. And we're beginning to think that possibly one way of doing this, instead of trying to do it for the whole of the UK at once, is actually to do it in regions. So with our Turing Health programme, we're actually working in partnership with Health Data Research UK, and they have regions of 7 or 8 million people that will give us the base for some of this work. And we're also exploring working with particular hospitals, because that is another confined set of data that allows us to move into this kind of work. But I offer that as a kind of think big challenge. Now, my second use of this diagram is to note that, as I said earlier, it's generic. And certainly the penny dropped for me. I mean, I now see all sorts of people referring to learning machines, so it's part of my own learning experience talking about this. But I started to realize that this was generic. And in fact, any flow through a system, and so I've given a series of examples there. Social care system is obvious, unemployed people. So in terms of government agencies, seriously potentially interesting for DWP. I think a very clear example is offenders going into prisons. I think, I'm not sure what I dare say about it, but it's an example where I'm saying in health, huge progress has been made. I think in something like the prison system, probably very little progress has been made, although there is now ambition to rectify this in the Ministry of Justice, for example. But you can do the same thing. Prisoners are coming into prison. The equivalent of medical diagnostics is actually making judgments in a way, but it can be machine learning driven about their risk profiles, their triggers. And then to work towards the equivalent of a treatment plan is actually a sentence plan in MOJ jargon, in court jargon, that is aimed at reducing the chance of reoffending. So it's the equivalent, as it were, of being cured of something in the health system. And it seems to me that that is entirely a feasible proposition. But the challenges are huge. We actually have it at the moment as one of our research projects within the Turing Institute, working with the MOJ, and I'm really pleased to think of moving forward on that. You could do it for monitoring students, pupils in the education system at any level. One of our classic wicked problems has been that for decades, something of the order of 20% of kids are coming out of the school system not very well qualified in terms of reading, writing, the basics. And it's been that sort of figure. I mean, it's probably a bit better now than it was 10 or 20 years ago, but it's not a lot better. The classic wicked problem that everybody's known about it, policies have been put in place to deal with it, and it's still there. And what I can't understand is, I've been, in a sense, talking about tracking patients going through the health system. I mean, without interfering with privacy and liberties in a fundamental way, can't we track the kids who we're losing from the school system and actually think about, I've been talking about personalised medicine. Can't we talk about versions of personalised education that won't actually lose kids? And so on. And I think for any system that has a flow of people where decisions have to be made, either by themselves or by agencies, you can think of actually this kind of system beginning to work. So I think there are huge challenges there. So that's my first example of two. And my second example is to go to my own field on cities. And so think about planning future cities. And if I'm talking about this, I usually start with this slide, which was produced by my colleague Mike Batty in UCL. And it's actually, it's the rank order by population, but it's rank. It's not a measure of population. It's the rank order of population, actually over a century or more, actually. It's from 1901 to 2011. And it's a kind of warning that if you think you can actually predict the future of cities, look at this diagram. There's not much volatility in terms of the top 10, but there's a tremendous amount of volatility in the rest of it. And you can actually see the Industrial Revolution at work. You can actually explain a lot of it. But it seems to me that it's at least a mildly entertaining starting point, but it's a warning of the challenge of modelling future cities. And as I'll say in a minute, you can't predict the future. What I want to say is very clear in the health case what we're trying to do. We're trying to prevent disease, we're trying to treat disease, and it's well understood. And in cities, it's probably a bit less well understood. And I want to work through half a dozen slides that will very briefly sketch the challenges for future city planning. And again, implicitly or explicitly in a minute, I want to argue it can be seen as a big operational research challenge. But it's for real. So we're thinking about the UK, taking that as an example. First thing to say is there will almost certainly be very large population increases. Brexit and all that notwithstanding, migration policies notwithstanding, there will almost certainly be very large population increases. So you might be talking, I've said there, 10 million over 25 years. You can put some pluses and minuses on that. But you know, it means 10 cities of the size of 1 million people. It means expanding existing cities. It's a lot of people. And it's in a, and what I've gone on to say in that slide in terms of what people need, and I'm stating the obvious, you know, it's housing, it's work. You need work because that's where your income comes from. If you haven't got any income, you've got all sorts of other problems. And I'll say more about that on the next slide. And the delivery of services. So I've been talking about health, education, the criminal justice system, and so on. So these are the key dimensions of planning. You then turn that into land uses, densities of housing, and so on. So there's a big challenge there. And at the end of this, it's not just a matter of building houses. It's a matter of understanding the nature of urban problems. And these slides came out of a study I chaired for the Government Office for Science on the future of cities, where we were trying to take ourselves into a 50-year time horizon. But of course, we decided, I was working with Mark Walpert, and we decided at the beginning, or Mark decided actually, and I was slightly worried about it at first in terms of the scale of what we had to do. But between us, we visited over 20 cities. And we always had round tables of different groups of people, different responsibilities. We always used to finish up saying, you know, what are your biggest challenges? What are your biggest problems? And first or second on the list was always social disparities. And I use that as an example because urban planning isn't just about building housing estates and somehow hoping it will all work. And my simple memory of that is being in Edinburgh and straight into Socialist spices. We didn't prompt this, it always just came out of the conversation. And somebody said, and I don't know the geography of Edinburgh, but I presume this is true. Somebody said, I can take you to the Leith Canal, and if you live on one side of it, your life expectancy is 80. If you live on the other side, it's 58. And it's these kind of things which I want to see as the challenges for future urban planning. But I'll whiz through these slides now a little bit more quickly. So I've got 6 of these headings that characterize the challenges. First is how people live in cities and what we all need if we live in cities. And then the economy of cities is obviously critical to this. For urban economies to succeed, you need a skilled labour force, you need a high quality environment, you need high quality services. And you can actually correlate measures of these variables with success and lack of success in cities across the country. So it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all problem. In terms of work, what everybody will be aware of, because we read it in the press every day, is there's potentially, not potentially, there almost certainly is, but let me just say potentially, a large hollowing out challenge. And the hollowing out is saying that jobs at the top will survive, certain kinds of service jobs. On the whole, I don't think we're going to have robots that will cut our hair, to take a trivial example, but a very important one. And there are lots of service jobs of that kind. In the middle, there are estimates that something like 50% of jobs could be automated. Now, we've lived through industrial revolutions before, and new jobs have been created. I'm an optimist. I would like to think that new jobs will be created this time round as it was through the Industrial Revolution. There is a feeling that A, that might not be true this time, and B, even if it is true, there may be a 10 or 15-year gap before we have the kinds of jobs that will actually fit the economy in the age of AI. And so we may have, over the next 10, 15 years, a serious challenge. Sustainability and climate change. Everybody in this room will understand the critical nature of this. In terms of urban development, at the moment, almost everything is still going in the wrong direction. Trips are getting longer. A large proportion of trips are still being made by car. The housing estates you see springing up all over the place as the government tries to meet our current housing challenge. Numbers have risen from about 100,000 a year to about 160,000 a year. And they're still relatively low density. And, I sometimes drive to a particular place in Norfolk. I drive past a town like Swaffham. I see big housing estates being built on the edge of Swaffham, which in many ways is good. It's helping the housing problem. And then I think, where are these people going to work? And the answer is going to work in Norwich. It's 25 miles away. The only way they can get there is by driving. And that will help me make a point, which I'm going to come back to in a second. So the shape of cities is about densities. Infrastructure is critical. There's all the argument about high-speed rail, HS2, you read about all the time, £50 billion for HS2. There's a kind of argument, which is, it's almost gone now. I think HS2, I think we're committed to, but there have been arguments, would we be better off spending £50 billion to enhance local transport infrastructure in cities to help move people away from cars rather than on intercity transport? No easy answer to that. Now, I want to say 2 things about this. If there was a key message from this study, it was that all these challenges are interdependent. And it's a serious challenge for the planning of future cities. I've illustrated that in relation to housing, but I can go through each of my 6 headings. The one I missed out was governance, actually, I think. You probably say I've only done 5. Is that they are interdependent. In terms of seeing it as a big modelling challenge and a big OR challenge, the implication from my first slide, and is, you can see it both intuitively and in mathematical terms, you can't do long-run forecasting. I mean, there are too many uncertainties. What you can do is to use the modelling and analytics tools to explore a variety of scenarios and then try and work out what the good ones might be in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, and what the bad ones might be, and what you have to start doing now to progress towards the good ones. And again, I think there's nothing like enough of that kind of work being done. And I just want to say a little bit about the modelling underpinnings of doing this kind of work. And I want to use, again, this is a UCL model developed by Mike Batty and his colleagues. And if I think about urban modelling, which I've been working on for a long time, doing it for London was quite a big challenge. And London is probably the only authority in the country now that actually, working with TfL, has its own team to run these models, use it as the basis for planning London in the future. Computing power and data, but particularly computing power, is now such that we can build these models for the whole country simultaneously, at once. So we can build a model of the UK as a big city, if you like. And I've put some numbers on these. These kind of models need underpinning transport systems. So the road system has 3.5 million nodes and 8.5 million links. And even doing the simple bits of shortest paths through these kind of networks, is a big computing challenge. But now we can model the whole country. I want to say one simple lesson from that. If we do the development work on this, it's still very much at the research stage, although it is working. Any one of the 164 planning authorities in England could have this analytic capability in the way that basically only London has it now. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I'm not exaggerating very much. And so it's one example of the new modelling analytics that will drive things. And this is a system, it's called Quant. That's doing UK on the right, it's doing Merseyside on the left, it's doing London in that slide. And then you can use this kind of model to test the impacts of big infrastructure. So Mike and his colleagues will look at population changes that are going to be driven by Crossrail. Obviously, people moving nearer to Crossrail, the red lines, you can do the same thing for HS2. So again, the advantage of having the model on the UK system is that you can work on these big infrastructure projects. And we've been talking to the National Infrastructure Commission, who would actually like to see a digital twin, about which this could be the urban development part. We then need to link it to utilities modelling. It will then connect to the sustainability agenda, and it will help to drive forward. Now, I've slightly misjudged the time, so I'm really going to, because I'd like to leave a bit of time for a few questions for anybody who wants to raise questions. But I was going to illustrate urban modelling by saying something more about retail, but I think I'm going to largely skip this. And I don't like doing these talks without having some equations in, so I'm going to flash through 2 equations without talking about them. But retail modelling is a good example of something which for quite a long time now we've actually been very good at. That's London. And I never changed this slide, which I'm embarrassed by. The yellow blocks are actually retail centres, which are something like 200. The light blue dots, which you can't see because they're on a blue background, are actually residential centres. There are 600. So if you're modelling flows to retail centres, you're dealing with a 200 by 600 matrix, very disaggregated. In fact, those are the equations that make it work. That's what you have to do to make it really work. We actually, I usually throw this slide in, because this is going back quite a few years now, but with Martin Clark, who's a colleague when I was in Leeds, we actually set up a spin-out company to run to run these kind of models, and these are the kind of clients we had. And the only reason why I use this slide is to say it actually works. I'm not talking pie in the sky, as it were, for applications of this kind of modelling. But the challenge is to take it beyond retailing. What we do in retailing, we don't even do properly in health, actually. partly into other sectors, but partly into looking at the dynamics of retail sector development. And what hasn't, the things I've just shown you is now all internalized in the big retailers. The big supermarkets use all this kind of modeling themselves. You can actually model the dynamics of retail centre growth and decline, because that's very topical at the moment. The owners of big retail centres are in some difficulty at the moment, as you read about in the business pages daily. So there are new challenges applying the skills in other areas that look like retail, where these skills haven't been applied, and also the insights from dynamic modelling. And for instance, if somebody wants to think of building a new retail centre as distinct from a particular store, we can actually, in principle, use the dynamic analysis to say how big it is, how big it has to be at the start for it to succeed. And in terms of the dynamics of it and the underlying modelling of it, if you're on the wrong side of an unstable point, you'll jump to zero. And if you're on the right side, which means above it and the system's bigger, you'll jump to a stable point. But understanding that is critical. And this is my final use of this slide. And it's an offer of a research challenge for anybody who would like to take it up. I've been arguing about learning machines. I've been talking about cities. If you think about, instead of patients coming into a system or offenders coming into a system, if you think about just the citizens of a city and your equivalent of medical diagnosis is to say for different kinds of citizens in different parts of the city, what are their challenges and what should the planners be doing about it? My intuition is telling me that there's actually quite an interesting research problem there, but it's quite a difficult one. So, a couple of slides just to round off. I'm really here just summarising, what I've been saying. That obviously the OR agenda will carry on, but with bigger computing power, new data, and the AI toolkit. And I've given you some examples, I hope, of what's in the AI toolkit. Partly, by the way, talking about urban modelling, and then my final diagram is to say something about the Mike Lynch challenge. I think we've got a long history of modelling. We've learned a lot. It's prior knowledge. How do you integrate that with machine learning? And again, similar questions for many fields. In my health example, I'm really saying there are different kinds of OR opportunities in terms of what I've been calling workflow. You take the three-phase system, you have to get everything in place and linked, and you have to have the feedback there in order to make it work. 2 slides, I think, now. So I'm saying there are new big system opportunities, and I've been arguing by example in terms of the embedding of learning machines. I think industry is probably ahead of the game, actually. And some of the big consultants are actually very, very good at applying machine learning algorithms in industry. And no doubt some of you will be here tonight who are working on those kinds of projects. What I'm arguing is that I think what is underdeveloped in this area, and I'm not saying, by the way, that we shouldn't be concerned with the challenges of industry. It's obviously a big issue for OR. So I've said there with major OR input. But in the planning and delivery of public services, I've got the health, social care, education, justice, the economy, transport, energy, environment, city planning, work and pension, everything that I've been talking about. And you can I've been saying if you're looking at this in aggregate, a lot of this is interdependent. So you need the really big system that's handling the interdependence. But most of these merit big system OR in their own right, any one of those words or phrases in that second bullet point. So virtually every area of government should be open to this. So I'm talking about doing this system by system, getting beyond silos, meeting the challenges of interdependencies. And the message that I'm meaning to run right through this in bold at the end is to say that OR has the opportunity to be innovative and transformative with what I'm calling the AI toolkit, provided it will take on these think big challenges. Thank you. Thank you very much.